May I now request Dr. Singhvi to kindly address the honorable members on the subject.
Dear friends, after having had the privilege of hearing my colleague Jairam, you now have the privilege of being harassed by me on privileges after 5 o'clock, when all of you must have been hoping to get home by now. But just as my duty calls, I think you have relatively limited options. So you have to endure this privilege of being harassed for a little longer. But I must start by saying it's truly a privilege, as always, and I've done it a few times earlier, to speak to this set of distinguished members of a very, very special, privileged club, the Temple of Democracy, which is what Parliament is. And it's gratifying that you've turned out in such decent numbers during the unhappy COVID times. Of course, the irony I find from MPs on and off in private gossip sessions when they mention the word privilege is to ask me that the only privilege which public life people or politicians have is the privilege of being criticized, the privilege of being distrusted, the privilege of being treated very caustically and cynically, the privilege of being treated as elites with pelf and power. So very few of us are really allowed to enjoy what are seen as large privileges of members of Parliament. There is much more of mocking and vilification than of a privileged status. But since I've been asked to speak on parliamentary privileges, let me start with a very short opening about the historical perspective, because that is how these things really started. And in our case and in most of the Commonwealth, it has a direct nexus to England, where Parliament itself was born amidst circumstances. The very institution and concept of Parliament was born amidst circumstances where it had to fight the tyranny of the sovereign, king or queen, where it had to fight executive authority as represented by the king or queen. In England, in particular, simply groups of noblemen and landlords, people who owned land, people who had some position of power and respect in society, got together to form, in the early 12th century, what was known as the Witan, and slowly it developed into a council. So by 1300, for the first time, they started calling this council Parliament. Nothing but a motley ragtag group of people who belonged to the influential sections of that society. But over time, from 1300 onwards, till the British Civil War in the 17th century, there was a constant tension between the so-called Parliament in its early nascent stages and the sovereign. So Parliament would, for example, in the 14th century itself, they said, all taxation you do should be approved by us. And the king would say, what the hell, who are you? I am the sovereign, I used to do tax as I like. Who are you to ask me that Parliament must approve the taxation? Or there would be periods of tension during the reigns of particular monarchs, like Charles I or Richard II. And the monarch would freely send in his forces to arrest a particular member of Parliament or to take action by imprisoning him in the Tower of London, and so on and so forth. Cromwell, who was nothing but a military commander who in a sense deposed the king, created virtually his own parliament because he passed a rule that anybody associated with the king could not become a member of Parliament. So he selected who could enter Parliament in the first place, and they started calling it the Rump Parliament. So in this Jaddo-Jihad between the 1300s and the 1600s, 1700s, slowly concepts emerged by which the parliamentarians tried to preserve both their collective rights as an institution called Parliament and equally their individual rights as members of Parliament. So, for example, as late as the late 17th or mid 17th century, James I kept repeating that whatever privileges or rights or immunities you have are at my grace, at my sufferance. Only what I give to the extent I give. When the House of Commons protested, he simply picked up a few MPs and put them in the Tower of London. And he dissolved Parliament, and in fact the story goes that he tore out those offending pages of the parliamentary record, which in England is called Hansard, which had recorded Parliament's protest inside the House. He simply tore them and said, you have privilege only to the extent I give it to you. So, then again in the next century, there were issues where people, what they spoke in Parliament, led them to be prosecuted. Why did you say this? Why did you not say this? How did you say it? So freedom of speech emerged as the second measure. The first was reporting of Parliament, the tearing up of the reports. How could you report this? The second was freedom of speech inside Parliament. And third, there was a very interesting case called Stockdale versus Hansard. Hansard is the reports of England, which report parliamentary proceedings, where Stockdale sued Hansard for defaming him. And Hansard said, look, I'm only reporting what is happening in Parliament. All of this led Parliament at different times to assert that A, we must have the freedom of speech inside the House. That's how that immunity, what we call a privilege today, arose. B, we must have a full immunity and protection about what is reported. Otherwise, technically, if you report what is in Parliament, it could cause defamation outside. So the reports are also similarly protected. Thirdly, slowly, all committee work is similarly protected. And in fact, in both 1704, they made an interesting declaration because the king got worried. He said, yes, you are claiming privileges. I'm happy to give you some privileges, but I don't know what privileges you have. We have not codified, we have not specified the privileges as to 1, 2, 3, 4. So in 1704, they passed a very interesting act which said, okay, we agree that whatever privileges we have in 1704 shall stand frozen as the privileges of Parliament. This is one of the greatest mysteries of the world, which actually operates in 2021 in India also. If you trace 1704, your next stop in India would be the Constitution of India, which when enacted on 26th November said, the privileges of this country's parliament shall be those which existed with the House of Commons as on 26th January 1950. Again, nobody specifies, but we froze it. And what existed in the House of Commons was frozen in 1704. Interestingly, in the 44th Amendment, this sentence in our article which said that the privileges shall be as in the House of Commons was changed to say it shall be as they exist in the Indian Parliament. Because Shanti Bhushan, the law minister then who moved it, said that we can't have the Indian Constitution using reference to imperial parliament like the House of Commons. So they amended it in 1978. But the interesting part is that be it 1704, be it 1950, be it 1978, or now be it 2021, we have frozen parliamentary privileges, we have recorded recognition of parliamentary privileges in 2 articles of the Constitution, for Parliament in 105 and for state assemblies in 194. But we have deliberately omitted codification, consciously omitted specification to date. And I'll come to that debate in a minute because there's been a lot of debate about should you codify and should you not codify. Well, friends, that's a bit of history to tell you the evolutionary matrix of how the dynamics of opposing forces in England led to the creation of parliamentary privileges. There is then, of course, there are many, many meanings. You have all these booklets from Rajya Sabha, and you have Erskine and May, and you have Call and Shakdar. One of the simplest meanings of parliamentary privileges a reference to rights and immunities enjoyed by Parliament as an institution and by MPs in their individual capacity, without which the discharge of their duties would not be facilitated or possible. To particularize this definition, you can look at a few quick facets before we come to further details. No exhaustive summary is available, no codification has happened, but obviously things like you cannot arrest or seize a person within the house without the permission of the chair. Interestingly, you can. In criminal law you can, but you need the permission. Same things I said earlier, you cannot interfere in proceedings. You cannot affect the right of the house to exclude guests or decide whom they do not want to exclude or want to exclude. And you cannot punish except by Parliament for breach of parliamentary privilege. Of course, there are quaint rules that for, in the old days, you could be sent to prison for a civil debt. Prison was not only for criminal. If you had a civil debt and you were unable to pay, which is now virtually, it exists in a theoretical sense, courts can still send you, but it hardly applies in practice. So one of the parliamentary privileges is that when parliament session is on, you can't be sent to jail for a civil debt. However, it doesn't apply to criminal. So criminal proceedings can lead to incarceration even when parliament is on, and so on and so forth. These are all quaint kind of old rules which have a colonial backdrop and have continued across the Commonwealth. Let me next for a few minutes analyze Article 105, which of course each of you do not have with you, but it's an interesting article too, because we've now fast-tracked to January 1950. And what our framers thought fit was to create this article for the Indian Parliament, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and to create a similar Article 194 for the assemblies. And it says, its title in fact, Powers, Privileges, Immunities of Parliament and its Members. Powers, privileges, subject to the provisions of this Constitution and to the rules and standing orders regulating the procedure of Parliament, there shall be freedom of speech in Parliament. So subject to your own rules. This is the first. This comes back from that old king's thing, who used to stop freedom of speech inside Parliament. Second is, no member of Parliament shall be liable to any proceedings in any court in respect of anything said by him in Parliament or in respect of vote given by him. And third is, in other respects, the privileges and powers shall be that which existed immediately as on 1978. Now, if you look at this article, and 194 is identical in respect of the other assemblies. Firstly, there is full freedom of speech in each House of Parliament and you can't be touched, but of course subject to your own rules. One of the obvious rules is expunction. So you have the liberty to defame and even abuse, subject to expunction. If you simply said freedom of speech in 105, it would not be enough, because our Article 19(1)(a), which recognizes free speech and freedom of press, is subject to all kinds of reasonable restrictions called defamation, contempt. So the freedom of speech for ordinary speakers is not absolute, even though we have a very strong constitutional protection as a fundamental right called freedom of speech. Parliamentarians in that sense have a higher freedom of speech, because the right to speak in Parliament, so far as the outside world is concerned, is absolute. There is no defamation against them, no contempt against them. In fact, there is nothing in terms of ordinary law. Yes, for that very reason, the intra-parliamentary procedure is important, so your rules don't permit you to say some things. Your rules permit the speaker to expunge, which is how free speech is regulated. The constitutional codification point is the second part of 105, bracket 2, that you can't be prosecuted for what you say or how you vote. As I gave you the example that some members of Parliament were prosecuted by the King's Police in England for sedition, for how they spoke in Parliament. So that's 1052. This is again our constitutional recognition of that age-old privilege which English parliamentarians won for themselves. Then they expanded it further in our constitution that not only what you say and what you vote, but what is reported about what you say and what you vote is equally protected. Otherwise, the publication of parliamentary proceedings would separately constitute defamation, maybe, or contempt of court. And then, of course, is the other carve-out that we have decided as far as the Constitution is concerned, that we will not codify. Example, I have given you 5 or 6 kinds of privileges you have, but there are many more. And it was easily possible that either the Constitution of India said that we hereby codify these privileges as 1 to 10. The Constitution could do it, did not do it. Or it could have said, this Constitution permits codification by law on or before so and so date. That also did not say. In fact, Ambedkar gave a very interesting reason to avoid codification. He said in the Constituent Assembly that how can you ask me to codify when Indian Parliament has not been born yet? Let Indian Parliament function for a few years, collect its customs and its practices, and then we'll consider codification. That's the reason he gave in the Constituent Assembly for not codifying. But the debate about codification is very serious and very major. Everybody outside of our so-called elite gatherings, because we are considered an elite club by the outside world. We may not be, but that's how a lot of the outside world looks at us. So everybody outside says, look, these guys have privileges on which they can punish us, but we even don't know what we are being punished about. It's a very strange power which Mr. Singhvi as a parliamentarian has to prosecute someone for breach of privilege when the breach of privilege is not listed. I mean, the nature of the privilege is not listed. So in effect, those who commit breach of privilege are those who are contravening parliamentary laws, if I may use the word laws loosely, without the law being known, is the accusation against us and is the argument given for codification. I, of course, have had a long mental debate, and earlier I used to be a votary of codification because it felt a little unfair that you are able to have all these so-called vast rights without even the public whom you may take action against knowing what they are. But having thought about it deeply, I am now a votary like Mavalankar of not codification, of non-codification. You have to rely on the maturity and the restraint and the wisdom of Parliament and its parliamentarians and not do codification, because the day you do codification is my own personal view, and it appears to have been the view over the last 70 years in our republic, because we have resisted and desisted from codification. The day you codify, that codification becomes like a statute, like a rule book. And the day it becomes a rule book, every comma, every full stop, every word, every adjective will be so-called judicially reviewed from the lowest court to the highest court. Your confrontational matrix with the judiciary will hugely increase. Your privileges, whatever they are, will actually diminish 100%. So, there is sometimes merit in ambiguity. There is merit in leaving the edges woolly. In fact, some of the greatest, largest powers have been consciously and deliberately left somewhat vague and ambiguous, which is why they work. The greatest pride of India in the field of constitutional law and the greatest envy of the world is the basic structure doctrine, a pure Indian invention. There is no other country which thought of this wonderful sentence which Palkiwala thought of, that even a constitutional amendment can be unconstitutional because it violates the basic structure. What a simple, fantastic, and it's a permanent bulwark against dictatorship of an absolute or a permanent kind. Irrespective of political party, irrespective of period, there can be no medium-term dictatorship also in India, leave aside long-term. because of the basic structure doctrine. There may be periods of aberration, short periods. Now, basic structure, when it came before the Supreme Court of the famous Keshavananda Bharati, with 13 judges, that one turning point, 6 this way, 6 that way, Justice Khanna went with the 6 to make it 7 and said that there are some basic elements of the Constitution which you can't amend even by a constitutional amendment. But then he desisted from specifying what they are. Exactly the parallel analogy of the codification of privileges. And then subsequent judgments after Keshwarananda was in 1973, we are now in 2021, almost 50 years of whatever after that. Minerva Mills, Vaman Rao, so many judgments, basic structure. None of them has told you that basic structure is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and it stops at 6. So individual case-wise, the judges retain that awesome power, incredible power to tell you what is basic structure in that particular case. As for example, Ramakrishna Hegde discovered in Bombay that federalism is a basic structure and he won the case. As for example, in some other case it is discovered that free and fair elections, Indira Gandhi Nehru versus Rajnarayan, decided that free and fair elections, which in turn must mean equal vote, which in turn must mean no debasement of the value of the vote, is part of basic structure because it is inherent in democracy and democracy is part of basic structure. So different cases have decided it without freezing or codifying what basic structure is. In a sense, the same applies to contempt of court. Courts have not limited as to what will remain the last word on contempt. So, why codify our privileges? Of course, there have been two views, and certainly I am not dogmatic about my view, but I think the better view is not to codify for the 3 reasons I gave: a diminution of parliamentary powers, a far greater confrontational matrix, and a actual intrusion willy-nilly from the smallest court to the biggest court, because something in a book somehow evokes the highest passions of review. Every word, every comma, every full stop starts being interpreted. This, of course, has been a debate in 1921. In a presiding officers conference, codification was debated, which included Indian presiding officers in British India. In 1933, in the Government of India Act debate, this was again raised, and they said, put a codification of privileges inside the Government of India Act of 35. It didn't happen though. The UK Secretary of State did not do it. Mavalankar from 1948, one of our most outstanding speakers, the person who made that famous statement, when I become a speaker, I have no eyes, no ears, no color, no direction. I don't look left, I don't look right. He opposed it. And in 1950, in a committee which he made of presiding officers of different states, they gave a report in 50, again, not accepting it. And the same stand happened in 4 major committee reports. I'm just cutting it short without giving you details. In 1965, in 1992, in 1997. And then the most comprehensive was in 2008, which was a 11th Lok Sabha report with parliamentarians traveling across the world to study the subject of privileges. And they specifically said that the majority is not in favor of codification. In between, of course, people made over-adventurous attempts to get courts to intervene. There is an interesting case in the name of the former Finance Minister C. Subramaniam from Madras High Court, where the challenge was that since Parliament has decided not to codify its privileges, you, the court, please declare, this is a decision of 1969, you please declare that all the privileges of Parliament have lapsed. Because these parliamentarians are very clever, they don't codify. Fortunately, the High Court said this is all nonsense and it dismissed the petition. In the context of the merger of the 2 television channels of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, another interesting debate which arose on and off is why not merge the 2 committees of privilege of each house. As you know, we have a 10-member committee, at least when I was a member, I think it was 10 members, I don't remember now. and a 15-member committee in the other house. And in our house, it's traditionally always by the deputy chairperson, who's the head. It arose in an interesting context. It may not be a bad idea, but I think it's a very touchy subject. It's an emotional subject, and people of each house don't like it. But it arose in a very interesting context in 1954, when Somnath Chatterjee's father, N.C. Chatterjee, who was a member of the Lok Sabha, gave a speech saying, "The house where I come from is a wonderful parliament," quote unquote. "The other house is a pack of urchins." Urchins, U-R-C-H-I-N-S. So the Rajya Sabha, some member raised a privilege motion against him. He was a member of the Lok Sabha. That was the first time the question arose, how does this house prosecute somebody for a privilege committed by a member of the other house? Of course, they settled it rightly and practically. All the presiding officers met and they said that whenever this happens, that's the practice now followed for the last 60 years. They said whenever such a thing happens, the person raising it, the house raising it, house 1, will refer it to the presiding officer of house 2. Of course, the house 1 can drop it if it is nothing. But if it finds it good enough to go on, it will refer it to the presiding officer of the house to which the alleged breacher belongs. And then that presiding officer will continue with it in the same procedure as if it is a breach of that house, so that he can again prosecute it, drop it, take it further, etc., etc. So that is how it is. But obviously, if you merge the two committees, this problem would be lesser. Not that I think it's a very strong ground for merging it. One of the reasons against codification, which is one of the reasons for codification given, is that Parliament is very wanton and very over-adventurous and lack of discipline in exercising privilege. That is statistically wrong. Actually, Parliament has displayed exemplary restraint, at least the figures show that, and although my figures are a little dated, I tried to check up with Rajya Sabha, they don't have the latest figures. It shows that they have been very restrained and a modicum of moderation in the exercise of privileged power. The figures I have are somewhere around 2010, but in 2009 or 10, over the last 50 years before that, or 55 years, the state assemblies even would have been far less restrained than Parliament. And the figures then were that in that year, 2009 or 10, Lok Sabha had 1 case of admonition, 2 cases of reprimand, and 1 case of expulsion, which I think is a very moderate, excessively moderate figure. And RS, Rajya Sabha, then had only 2 cases. And I don't think it has changed radically after. Of course, the number of cases initiated maybe much more. But those which come to fruition in terms of actual action taken or punishment done is, I think, very much more limited. There are 2 important constitutional judgments on this subject, which are very old, but which must be always remembered on a discussion like this. Because they would be possibly licenses for future adventurism by other organs like the judiciary, which is always looking much more jealously and zealously at your rights than you look at their rights or the abuse of those rights. Those 2 cases are, the first is a Constitution bench in 1959, a very famous case called MSM Sharma. And the second is in 1965, an even more famous case called Keshav Singh, which you know as the Searchlight case. They established 2 landmark principles of law. In Sharma, the issue arose that what a person said in Parliament was sought to be prosecuted outside Parliament. And there was a reverse issue that what people are saying outside should be protected by free speech, even though it breaches a privilege of Parliament. So there's a 2-way street. So outside Parliament, I abuse him. in the discharge of his parliamentary duties, he should not have a breach of privilege action against me because I have my own 19(1)(a). I meaning I am not a member of parliament, I am an outsider. I have 19(1)(a) in the constitution, so why should that not protect me? And why should a mere MP be able to exercise a unwritten, uncodified law to prosecute me for what I said about him? So the Sharma court by 5 judges rightly decided, which is a very important principle, that 19(1)(a) must give way to 105 and 194. Which means your free speech right is subordinate to the right of parliamentary privilege, which is not an exception mentioned in 19(2). So you cannot exercise free speech to the extent that it can violate a parliamentary privilege, even though the parliamentary privilege is uncodified, unknown in that sense. In Keshav Singh, a more interesting issue, in Sharma only the free speech issue had arisen. In Keshav Singh, a second issue arose involving a nuance on that. And that was that yes, you cannot exercise your free speech in a way that it infringes an MP's parliamentary privilege. But what if the parliament and that MP takes action which impinges not only your free speech right but also your right to life, Article 21? So suppose parliament issues a notice saying that immediately, because let us say he said or wrote something, without any delay at the middle of the night, pick up this person, arrest him in handcuffs and bring him to my house. House meaning parliament's house. Or that he should be picked up and sent straight to jail, as it is. Now technically it may be in a gross case a parliamentary privilege case, but there the court held that while 19(1)(a) would yield to 105 and 194, Article 21 will not yield. So you see how the dynamics of articles are decided in this way. These two principles stand up to date. Of course, over time, these are judgments of the 60s. We are now in 2020, 21. Over the last 60 years, Article 21 has become a laundry list of every right you can think of. There are judgments of the Supreme Court which talk of air, hygiene, living with dignity. Short of saying that a right to sneeze is an Article 21 right, every possible thing is included in the right in the laundry list of 21. That cannot be the basis by which 21 and 105 are juxtaposed. Otherwise, there will be no privilege left. So ultimately, everything can't be written in a book. It has to be maturely applied by both mature parliamentarians and mature judges. Let me come to a very interesting contemporary current issue, which is sub judice, and therefore I will speak about it with some restraint, but it is not sub judice in that sense. It is now orders are reserved. The judgment is expected any week. But it's very fascinating. It's the Facebook case. And I just wanted to mention this as a case study for all of you who might be interested. You must discount everything I say with a bucket full of salt because I appeared for the NCT, the main responding party. Facebook was the petitioner. I was the respondent. My name is NCT, Government of NCT. The interesting facet was that Facebook was called by the NCT's assembly. They have a committee called a Committee of Peace and Harmony, headed by the young MLA, Mr. Raghav Chadda. And they called Facebook well after the CAA riots and everything is over to give evidence, as they had called about 50 other people on diverse issues. In the case of Facebook, they wanted to discuss issues about, according to the chairman's statement and his letter, issues about how to strengthen the non-abuse of social media in volatile or incendiary situations. The notice was issued to Ajit Mohan, the head of Facebook, I think the India head. The notice was a little over-aggressive. And the last para said that failure to attend may involve privilege against you, may invoke privilege. Of course, this is a summons only to attend and to give evidence to a committee. There's no question of privilege, nothing has happened. But obviously the last sentence is failure to come. Meanwhile, the same Ajit Mohan and the same Facebook had appeared before standing committees of parliament on similar subjects, willingly and without much protest. But when they got this notice from NCT, they wrote back saying that we are outsiders. You cannot insist on attendance of outsiders. And you cannot compel us to attend if we don't want to. If I don't want to educate and enlighten the NCT Delhi's committee, then I can choose not to. And you can't compel me on pain of privilege to attend. And the other argument, the more important argument they raised was that you, NCT, are a truncated legislature. You do not have three powers: land, law and order, and police. And this relates to police and law and order at least, if not land. And therefore, if the legislative entry of the 7th schedule excludes this power to the NCT, then it equally excludes the NCT from calling me, Facebook, to give evidence to a legislative assembly committee. This led Facebook to file a direct petition in the Supreme Court, which was heard for over 4 weeks, and orders reserved just now. Mr. Salve appeared for Facebook, I appeared for NCT, and some other people appeared for it. Now, I'm not going to go into what the order is, and hopefully the order will come in 2 or 3 weeks. But very fascinating issues which arise, which you must just, and I'll illustrate them from our point of view, the points I raised. This is purely by way of illustration. It is not that it has been held this way or that way. First is that can you avoid or ignore a summons on the ground that you are a non-assembly person, I mean non-MLA? One of the principal grounds was, I am not an MLA, I don't come under your jurisdiction, you can't summon me. Now I will just give you the details. There are innumerable examples of innumerable assemblies and bodies which have always subjected non-members to privilege. Indeed, if non-members were in a blanket absolute proposition sense excluded from privilege, then the powers and the immunities of privilege would be reduced to vanishing point. We gave innumerable examples from the 60s and 70s. Thaniram, where the Kerala Assembly reprimanded the person. Satyayug, Uthavani, these are all from different states. Karnataka, West Bengal, Kerala, Tripura, etc., etc. So the blanket proposition of Facebook that there cannot be a non-member called or summoned on pain of privilege cannot be possibly true because it's too wide a proposition. Second, in a sense, Facebook was asking for an advance ruling because I can understand, you see, if I call you for a privilege, if I call you for a committee meeting, suppose I am a committee, standing committee here of IT, just for a minute, let's assume that, and I chair the parliamentary standing committee of IT, and I call somebody, and in the course of the meeting I say that, look, I want to ask you that on so-and-so date you were spotted in so-and-so area, and the CCTV suggests that you assaulted or killed so-and-so. I'm just giving a hypothetical example in a committee meeting. It is entirely possible, according to me as a lawyer, that the man may say, I will not answer this question on a variety of grounds, self-incrimination, Article 20, Article 21, right to life, etc., etc., because you can't ask a person an incriminating question. But before the stage of questioning has arrived, can a person say that you, Mr. Committee, can't summon me on the ground that I'm a non-MLA? Or a non-member, a non-parliamentarian? That would make a mockery of privileges. Third, without knowing the content of questions, without knowing the content of the proceedings, a priori you say that you can't call me and I will not come. If you do not, then, according to me, privilege totally applies. If you don't have a power of privilege to compel attendance, then how do you do attendance? How does a committee function? The only power you have of compelling attendance is that. The other argument, of course, which is more substantive and possibly a much better argument for Facebook, is that please decide legislative competence first. is the parliament competent, is the assembly competent to summon on a subject which relates to law and order and police? Because suppose the Assembly of Delhi called Mr. XYZ for atomic energy or relations with Russia. It is possible to say that what the hell do you have to do with atomic energy and relations with Russia? You have no power under the 7th schedule. The question which was argued at the Supreme Court was that there are several other entries, entry 39 for example in list 2, which directly gives wide powers of inquiries, compelling attendance explicitly. Peace and harmony and inquiries into ways to strengthen peace and harmony, which may relate to social media strengthening, safeguards, other rules and nitty-gritty things, is a much wider concept which can't be limited to only police and law and order. So how do you, Mr. Facebook, say that police and law and order is the only subject which this committee is calling you for? And how can you in advance make that view of your own and then say, to hell with you, I won't come? So, this is the lie of the land. And this is the question which the court will determine. So, while a patent lack of jurisdictional power in that entity will not allow the assembly of that entity to call you, equally you have to interpret these legislative entries very widely and liberally, not as narrow, extremely, narrow fields of power. So this was argued on both premature, competence, etc., etc. Incidentally, courts across the world, including US courts, have given the widest meaning to legislative inquiries. The temple of democracy has many roles. Parliament has multifarious roles: to pass laws, to do intra-house discussions, also to inquire. It has been called rightly the grand inquest of the nation. Without the grand inquest of the nation, what will Parliament do? Or Parliament, when I say Parliament, includes the Assembly. So, judgments in the United States, in England and in India have said the inquiry by legislatures, which is what committees and standing committees and things like that are, should be given the widest, broadest amplitude and not looked at in this very narrow way in which the amplitude is looked at by Facebook. May I end and enjoy the possibility of some question answer by saying two more things. We also must remember in privileges the delicate balance which the Constitution has made of mutual deference and mutual respect for different organs, the legislature and the judiciary. So that applies across the board, even to the subject of privileges. We have articles in the Constitution for Parliament 121, 122, for assemblies 212, etc., which say that you can't discuss what is going on in my house and I can't discuss directly what is the subject matter of a court proceeding. These are all deferential, equilibrium, delicate equilibrium rules, which ultimately no judgment, no law, but only maturity and wisdom can solidify. Yes, parliamentarians have to realize that, you like it or not, the last word will be of the courts. That is the way the judicial system is structured. You've already seen that while 19(1)(a) will not trump your privileges, 21 will trump your privileges. And who will decide whether it is 21 genuine or 21 non-genuine? Only the courts. Even a constitutional amendment passed by you can be unconstitutional if it violates the basic structure. Well, who will decide it's the basic structure? Only the courts. So the last word has to be with the courts. Raja Rampal's judgment to the Supreme Court, 2007, while reiterating the age-old rule that what goes on inside Parliament, how I, as the presiding officer, run the House, is totally off bounds. But then they add this thing: if some gross, quote-unquote, gross illegality or unconstitutionality occurs, then we can interfere. So the courts always keep that small window, that small door 2 inches open, so that there is not completely a lack of power. So that part, I think, again impinges directly on privileges, where you cannot consider it to be going whole hog without judicial review in extreme cases. Well, friends, thank you very much for being here, but I'm happy to have questions in whatever form, in either language. हाँ, गोयल sir.
अगर किस हाउस में member has used some words and then speaker or chairman has expunged those words,